Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar will be on clinical research overview, clinical trials, human subjects protection, data and safety and monitoring, and good clinical practice. I am Leonardo Cubillos. I am the director of the Center for Global Mental Health Research at the National Institute of Mental Health. Today's webinar is the second webinar of our 2023 Center for Global Mental Health webinar series. And altogether, since we started this series, is the 9th webinar. In 2022, we had 7 webinars that covered different scientific and administrative matters that we think are important. And in 2023, thus far, we have had 2 webinars. You can find all these recordings as well as a transcript in our NIMH web page. As I mentioned, we will be discussing clinical research overview and good practices in clinical research, as well as other very important aspects. I want to introduce our 3 speakers. But before I do that, I want to remind you that the 3rd webinar of the 2023 series will be on September 20. At 9 a.m. Eastern Time, we will be discussing RDoC in global. Our first speaker for today is Sabiha Etheridge. Sabiha Etheridge is a health policy analyst at NIMH's Office of Clinical Research. She has been with NIMH since 2013, and she has different responsibilities, though she focuses on human subjects protection for the NIMH clinical trials and clinical studies. Sabiha received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Duke University, and she has a master's of public health from Boston University. Our second speaker is Ashley Kennedy. Ashley Kennedy also works at the Office of Clinical Research, where she coordinates the clinical trial programs in the clinical trial operations branch within the Office of Clinical Research. She supports different experimental research activities, and she currently serves in different positions, helping in supporting global as well as domestic research studies. Our last speaker is Ana Ordóñez. Ana Ordóñez is the director of the Office of Clinical Research at the National Institute of Mental Health. Ana, by background, is a psychiatrist and a child and adolescent psychiatrist. She also completed a master's degree in health administration sciences at UCSF. Prior to coming to NIMH, Ana worked as a faculty at UCSF, where she also was involved in different areas of research. As you see, our 3 speakers today come from the Office of Clinical Research. We are delighted to have this office supporting the webinar series. And without further ado, I will pass it to Ana, who will kick us off in this great journey in learning about clinical research in NIMH. I wish you a great webinar, and I'll see you later during the round of questions and answers.
Thank you, Leo. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are all in the world. It's a pleasure for the Office of Clinical Research staff to be here today with you to present this webinar. I'm very excited to have Sabiha Etheridge and Ashley Kennedy join me in this presentation. The Office of Clinical Research provides consultation and support to our Institute in human research protections, in clinical trials operations, data safety monitoring, and many of the topics you're going to be hearing about today. We have Sabiha Etheridge joining us from the Human Research Protection Branch. She's a health policy analyst who's been with us for quite some time, since 2013, and has a host of responsibilities, including providing a lot of consultation and support to our NIMH staff and in turn to investigators in the field related to human research protections. And Ashley Kennedy, who's from our clinical trials operations branch, who's a clinical trial program coordinator and provides a lot of support to investigators who have studies that are coming to our data safety monitoring boards in terms of operational support. So you'll be hearing from her related to operations. We are excited to start today. This presentation has a lot of information in it, and so I am going to not take any more time and hand this over to Sabiha to get us started. And we look forward to hearing your questions at the end of the session and having some time to discuss. Thank you all very much, and on to you, Sabiha.
Thank you, Anna, so much. Like Anna said, this presentation has a lot of information, so bear with us. I also wanted to note that while you might not have the slide decks right now, you might be able to access the slides later on in a few weeks, and you'll probably receive correspondence via email on whether or not those slides have been put up. So I'd like to start today's presentation by saying that we're going to primarily focus on the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trial Information Form of the grant application, as well as some additional points to consider when you're filling out the grant application. The next few slides specifically speak to Section 3, the Protection and Monitoring Plan section of the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form. And just as an overview, again, I'll primarily be talking about this section in the next few slides. And this section is broken down into 5 subsections, and I will go into more detail for each of these subsections as we progress through the presentation.
Sabiha, just a quick technical point. I don't think your camera is on.
Oh, okay. My apologies, everyone. All right. So generally, the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form is used to collect information on human subjects research, and clinical trials. You want to include study population characteristics, protection and monitoring plans, and a protocol synopsis in this section. And also, this form collects information on human subjects and clinical trials, information on the study level. All applicants must use this form, regardless of whether you answer the question, are human subjects involved on the R&R and other project information form? One thing to note is that if you answer no to are human subjects involved, then you will go from that question and skip through the rest of the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trials information portion and move on with filling out your grant application. There's a detailed list of instructions on NIH's website there's a document called the General Instructions for NIH and other PHS agencies. And this document breaks down each section of the grant application and provides corresponding guidance for you to reference as you fill out the application. All right, so if you answered yes to our human subjects involved in your proposed research, you'll need to add a study record for each one of your proposed studies that will be involving human subjects research, and you do that by clicking on the Add New Study button. And then if you are conducting human subjects research and you're claiming exemption, you must justify why your research meets criteria for that exemption. And you should make sure to not just include the definition of the exemption or verbatim what might be in the regulations. You want to make it specific to why your research meets the criteria for that exemption. I provided some links that you will get once these slides are posted for some helpful resources to help you determine if you're doing human subjects research or if you're doing exempt human subjects research. And NIH specifically has a exempt human subjects research infographic on their website that is very helpful. If you're not proposing to do human subjects research, but you plan on using human specimens or data, you have to provide a justification for your claim of no human subjects involvement. And it's very important to make sure at that point that you really are truly not doing human subjects research. That can be something where we have seen applicants who think they're not doing human subjects research, but are actually doing it. So it's important to work with your IRB and your regulatory bodies. And if you have a Office of Human Research Protection, that's also a good resource to use when trying to figure out if you're doing human subjects research or not. The justification you give for whether your study meets criteria for exemption will be reviewed during peer review. So it's encouraged that you work with the resources that you have at your institution to make sure you're accurately determining whether your study meets exemption or not. The HHS Office for Human Research Protection has some helpful resources that can help you in determining whether or not you're doing human subjects research, or if you're doing exempt research. They have many tutorials and videos. I've provided a website that is very helpful. NIH also has some helpful resources. One of them that I particularly like is the NIH's decision tool. And this decision tool basically presents a series of multiple choice responses that help you determine whether or not you're doing human subjects research or you're doing exempt human subjects research. All right, so once you've determined that you're conducting human subjects research, or once you determine you're doing non-exempt human subjects research, NIH requires that you fill out the protection of human subjects attachment. And the information that you put in this attachment needs to be commensurate with the risk of the study, the size of your study, and the complexity of your study. It's also important to keep in mind that this protection of human subjects attachment is reviewed during peer review. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead with all of my slides. All right, so the protection of human subjects attachment is broken out or organized in 4 sections, and it's very important to make sure that you are providing the information that is relevant to each of these sections. So you have the risk to human subjects. So what are the risks that are going to be involved for people participating in your study? What are the strategies you have in place to minimize or protect against these risks? What are the potential benefits of the proposed research to the subjects? And what is the importance of the knowledge to be gained? One thing I want to note too is that in this section, there may be relevant in-country laws or regulations or policies that you may need to mention that are country specific. For example, the age of consent for medical intervention or research participation may differ from country to country. And you want to make sure you bring that up in this particular section. All right. So in writing the protection of human subjects attachment, it's very important to identify the potential risk, all the potential risks for the participants that are going to be involved in your study, and to consider the likelihood and the seriousness of these risks. So something that I want to note is that you need to make sure that you're considering everyone that would be considered a participant. And we see this often where individuals who are receiving the intervention are considered the participant, but some of the other participants may not be described in this section. So it's important to consider who exactly is providing study data. So it could be patients at a clinic, it could be clinic staff, it could be guardians or parents. So that's important to consider when you're considering the risk to human subjects as well. So in this section, the first thing you want to do is provide a description of the human subject's involvement, characteristics, and design. Specifically, a brief overview of the study design, a description of the study population for example, how old are the people that you're going to enroll? Who are the people? What are the inclusion exclusion criteria for the individuals you plan on enrolling? Will you be enrolling any vulnerable populations? The second portion, the second thing that you want to consider are the study procedures, the materials, potential risk to subjects associated with the intervention. Specifically, describe your planned research procedures involving human subjects. What research materials like biospecimens, data, study records will you be obtaining? You should also describe any private identifiable information that you might collect in this section as well. And very importantly, in this section, you want to discuss the risks to all potential subjects. So these risks could be physical, psychosocial, cultural, financial, legal risks. We want to talk about risk to loss of privacy, confidentiality, or any other risk that should be considered at this time. It's also important to talk about the risks associated with each of the interventions and procedures that you might have. So if individuals are undergoing multiple procedures, so if they're having surveys or interviews or also going through MRI scans, you want to make sure you discuss the specific risk to each one of those. Okay. So once you have discussed the study risks, you next want to talk about what strategies you have in place to mitigate these risks or protect against these risks. And the first part of that is discussing the informed consent process. So you want to talk about the informed consent process as well as how you're going to be recruiting individuals. For instance, are you required to obtain consent or assent or parental consent? Do you plan on requesting a waiver of informed consent from your IRB? Who's going to be seeking consent? What methods are you going to use to document consent? Are you going to obtain signatures? Is it going to be oral verification? Is it going to be a thumbprint? Another factor to think about in filling out this section are any strategies that you have in place to mitigate the risk you've described in the previous section where you listed the risk to study participation. The section is also where you describe incidental findings, such as those that may be found during imaging or screening tests or diagnostic tests or paternity tests. And lastly, if you are going to involve vulnerable populations, this is the section where you would want to discuss that. Next, you want to consider the potential benefits of the proposed research to the subjects or to others. And so the study may have a benefit for individuals, like individual participants, or it may benefit an entire population or community, but it's important to put that information in this section. You should also adequately describe how the potential risks to the participants appear reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits of the study. And one thing that I think it's really important to note that we see often is financial compensation should not be listed as a benefit of study participation research because it can appear coercive in nature. And so we recommend that it not be included in this part of the protection of human subjects attachment. Right. I move it forward. Thanks. Okay, lastly, you want to address the importance of the knowledge to be gained as a result of the proposed research, and you want to discuss why the risk to subjects are reasonable in relation to the importance of the knowledge that can be expected to be gained as a result of the study. All right, so for the next subsection of the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form, if you answer yes to there being a multi-site study, answer yes to your study involving a multi-site study that will use the same protocol to conduct non-exempt human subjects research at more than one domestic site, and I just want to note that by domestic site, I mean US site, then you will be required to use a single IRB to conduct the ethical review of the protection of human subjects. For NIH applicants, the single IRB plan attachment is no longer required. Instead, you have to provide a statement naming the single IRB of record in the just-in-time prior to award to make sure you're adhering to the NIH single IRB policy requirements. As a note, the single IRB policy does not apply to certain types of grants. So career grants, career development grants, research training grants, fellowship awards. And also, it's important to note that foreign sites participating in NIH-funded multi-site studies are not expected to follow the single IRB policy as well. And I have linked the NIH's single IRB policy here. If you answer yes to all the questions in the clinical trial questionnaire, which is in the PHS Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form, then you are required by NIH grant policy to include a data and safety monitoring plan, or a DSMP. And for those human subjects research that don't meet criteria for clinical trial, investigators still have the option to include a DSMP, but it's not required. An example of this would be if you have a study that's not a clinical trial, but may have significant risk to participants. Your DSMP is required to be commensurate with the risk of the trial, the size of your trial, and the complexity of your trial. The DSMP should include the following content as appropriate. You want to indicate how many people and what type of entity will be providing monitoring. So are you going to have, is it going to be the PI along with the independent safety, with the IRB, or will you have a independent safety monitor or a DSMB? You also want to provide a description of the overall framework for safety monitoring and what information exactly will be monitored. You want to talk about the frequency of monitoring, including any plans for interim analysis or any stopping rules if they're applicable to your study. And then you want to talk about how adverse events will be managed and reported in accordance with specific policies and guidance. You may have specific policies and guidance from your IRB, from the individuals or group that are monitoring the study, any other ethical or regulatory bodies that might be involved, and also the NIH awarding institution. NIMH, for instance, has a reportable events policy that it is required that NIMH-funded researchers adhere to. You may also want to ensure that to include your DSMP, who will be responsible for monitoring your study. So will it be the PI and IRB? Will it be an ISM? Will it be a DSMB? In some cases, it's acceptable for a PI and IRB alone to monitor the study. And these tend to be for lower risk studies that aren't blinded. In all cases, I want to note that the PI and IRB retain their monitoring and oversight responsibilities, regardless of any additional monitoring requirements that might be added. So if you were to have a DSMB enhances the monitoring responsibilities of the PI and IRB, they don't replace them. Independent safety monitors can be used as well. These are independent physicians or other appropriate experts with relevant expertise who can advise the study team or the NIH institution. You can also have independent monitoring committees or safety monitoring committees, and these are small groups of independent experts that monitor the study. And then you can have a data and safety monitoring board. And a data safety monitoring board, or DSMB, is a formal independent board of experts that it may include investigators or biostatisticians, but that are not associated with the study. One thing I want to note is that sometimes we see the terms independent monitoring committee or safety monitoring committee or data safety monitoring board used interchangeably. And these are different monitoring entities. So it's important when you're filling out the DSMP to make it very clear which one you're using. I'm going to go into more detail about DSMPs in some of the upcoming slides. NIH and NIMH have some helpful resources. The links are here on the slide for filling out the DSMP. So I would encourage you to reference these as you are writing your grant applications. All right, so next, if you answered yes to all the questions in the clinical trial questionnaire, you are required to answer the question regarding data safety monitoring boards. This is optional for all other human subjects research, but if you answer yes to all the clinical trials questionnaire questions, and you're required to do it. As noted in the previous slides, the monitoring responsibilities of a DSMB enhance those of the PI and IRB. They do not replace them. NIH requires the establishment of DSMBs for certain studies, for instance, multi-site clinical trials involving interventions that entail potential risk to participants, and also generally for all phase 3 clinical trials. As necessary, a DSMB may be appropriate for other studies, for instance, phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials, or other clinical trials that may be blinded or employ high risk interventions or involve vulnerable populations. NIMH, for NIMH grantees, there are 2 types of DSMBs that you may choose to have in your study or may be assigned to your study. Those are, the first one is an external independent DSMB that is usually established by the study team. The second is an NIMH constituted independent DSMB, which is appointed and convened by the NIMH director. NIMH sponsored DSMBs can be assigned for studies that are significantly greater than minimal risk, high risk studies, or at the discretion of NIMH leadership. If a DSMB is used at the time of your application, you want to make sure you describe the composition of the board without naming specific individuals. So you may say that you will have a biostatistician, or you'll have another relevant expert in the field of your research study. DSMB members are expected to be independent of any professional or financial conflict of interest with the research project or any of the investigators on the study. And as a note, once your grant is funded, it's expected that you will provide the NIMH with the DSMB members specific qualifications and conflict of interest statements indicating that they have no conflict of interest, no direct involvement with the study or with the investigators. NIH has some helpful links regarding monitoring of NIMH funded studies as well as DSMBs on the NIMH OCR website. All right, so lastly, in this section 3, the overall, you're gonna talk about the overall structure of the study team. Now, this attachment is optional, but I would suggest that you refer to your NOFO or your notice of funding opportunity for specific instructions on the overall structure of the study team attachment, because they may have some specifications in there. Within the attachment, you want to provide a brief overview of the organizational structure of the study team. You want to talk about administrative sites, data coordinating sites, enrollment participating sites, and any separate labs or testing centers that you might be using. I want to note that in this section, you should not include study members' individual professional experiences. So the information that you had in your bio sketch, this isn't the section that you would put that in. Okay, so now that we've covered points to consider when you're filling out the protection of human subjects attachment, And before moving on to the next segment of our presentation, I wanted to talk about some of the commonly identified human subjects issues that come up during NIMH review of applications, specifically the Human Research Protection Branch of the Office of Clinical Research. The NIMH program officers will consult with the Human Research Protection Branch of the Office of Clinical Research on matters involving the protection of human subjects. So it's not unusual that we would see these and these come up often. So this list isn't inclusive, but these are some of the more frequent things that we see. Oftentimes we see missing or inadequate DSMPs. A DSMP might have no mention of how adverse events will be monitored or reported. They may be doing screenings or imaging, and there are no plans for how incidental findings will be handled. There may be insufficient clinical oversight. So there may be a medication washout proposed, but there is no indication of whether or not there's an involvement of a licensed physician or other professional who will be monitoring this washout. And another thing that we see often is if pregnancy is listed as an exclusion criterion in the study, it's important to make sure you have a plan and a method for evaluating pregnancy status as needed. Okay, so now we're going to test your knowledge a little bit by asking you a couple of questions. So I hope it's fun. So we're going to go on, and I'm just going to, if you want to, you can put your responses to the questions in the chat box, but I will make sure to indicate which one is the correct response. All right, so the first one we have is, who designates if human subjects are involved in the proposed research? Is it A, the institution's signing official, B, the NIH program officer, C, the applicant, or D, the study statistician? And I'll give you just a second to write your responses in the chat box. See them coming in. All right.
Looks like it's between C and D for the audience.
All right, I'm gonna put the answer up now. It's C, the applicant. Good job. All right, so the next question we have is, which of the following is not a section that should be included in the protection of human subjects attachment? The statistical analysis plan, the adequacy of protection against risk, the potential benefits, the importance of the study team taking holidays. I don't know if this one was obvious or not, but all right, so the answer is the importance of the study team taking holidays. All right, so which of the following was a level of monitoring used in NIH funded grants? A DSMB, principal investigator and IRB, an independent safety monitor, or D, all of the above? And the answer is all of the above. Great, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Ashley Kennedy, who's going to take you through the operational aspects to consider when writing your grant application.
Okay, thanks, Sabiha. Now we're going to segue into the next part of the presentation, which is the operational aspects to think about when writing your grant application. Oh, how do you go back? Sorry, I skipped a few. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Can you go back? Okay, thank you so much. So as an overview, we're going to briefly discuss the inclusion policies for research involving human subjects, and then launch into the operational components to think about when you're writing your grant application. These include the study population and procedures, data confidentiality and quality assurance, regulatory considerations, and reportable events. So NIH has two inclusion policies. And the first is the policy on the inclusion of women and members of racial and ethnic groups. And this requires that women and members of racial and ethnic groups must be included in NIH-funded clinical research studies unless there is a compelling rationale for their exclusion. And so the rationale for their exclusion is usually based on the science. So for example, if you're doing a prostate cancer research study and you're not including individuals whose sex at birth is female, that's probably fine because the condition does not usually occur in that group. However, if maybe you're doing a study and you want to exclude women because it's too expensive to do pregnancy tests on everyone, that would not be acceptable. Cost is not an acceptable reason to exclude groups. So our next inclusion policy is our inclusion across the lifespan policy. And this policy requires that individuals of all ages must be included in NIH human subjects research unless there are scientific or ethical reasons not to do so. And so this was an expansion of our inclusion of children policy. And the requirement now has been extended to older adults and into the entire population. If you're going to exclude people based on age, you need to have a reason based on the science or an ethical or safety concern for them not to be included in your research study. Again, for another example, if you're studying pediatric cancer and you don't have older adults in the study, that's probably okay. The condition does not usually occur in that group. So if you're developing an application, you're going to need to include plans for inclusion of women and racial and ethnic minorities, and plans for individuals across the lifespan. So in your inclusion of women and minority plan, you'll need to include a description of the plan distribution by sex or gender, race and ethnicity, and you also need to provide a rationale for this selection. Some questions to think about when you're writing the rationale are, why does the population look the way it does? How did you decide what the demographics of your sample should look like? You're also going to need to justify your exclusions in this section. So for example, if you're not including women in your study, you would explain why you're not including women. You should also describe any proposed outreach programs for recruitment. So if you're working with community advisory boards, or if you have certain methods of recruitment that you're using, such as outreach at clinics, you should provide those in your application. You're also going to include a separate inclusion across the lifespan plan. And in that plan, you'll need to provide similarly a rationale for the age distribution. So describe the age of your participants. In particular, why did you choose participants of that age group? You're also going to need to explain how it will contribute to the analysis, and again, justify any exclusions based on age. So if your age limits are, say, 16 to 25, you're going to want to say, why did you choose those specific age limits? And why is it important to the science that you have participants of those specific age groups? You're going to also want to include a description of the study team expertise and the appropriateness of the facilities for those included age groups. So the purpose of the policy is not simply to include people and try to put them into a study that is not designed for them, but you also want to make sure that you have the right study team expertise to deal with those populations and make sure that you have the appropriate facilities. So also in your application, you're going to need to provide an inclusion enrollment report. You'll include both the plan and the actual data tables for your planned enrollment. So we have touched on the inclusion policies, and now we're going to go over the operational components to consider in writing your grant application. So writing your grant application involves spending a considerable amount of time describing how your scientific idea is valid, original, achievable, and valuable. In writing your application, you should also be thinking about how to turn your ideas into procedures that will ultimately allow you to recruit and enroll your population that you need, ask the participants to complete the interventions, and assessments that you are proposing and allow you to measure the study outcomes. When identifying your study population, you really want to consider who you are collecting data from. Is it going to be patients, clinicians, family members? Also, what kind of data will you be collecting from these people? This is going to help you in establishing who may be a research participant in your study. So let's go through some of the examples. Parent providing information about their child, such as their mental health history. In that case, the parent is likely not going to be considered a research participant. The next example is a parent providing information about their own mental health, such as their own diagnosis in the past. In that case, the parent is likely going to be considered a research participant. The last example is a provider being trained with a new treatment technique and their level of proficiency and the acceptability of the technique is being assessed. In that case, the provider will likely be considered a research participant. You should also be thinking about the population in your study. Some of the questions you might want to think about are, where are you going to recruit the study participants? What sites are participating in the study? Are the participants patients who go to the hospital or clinic? Is the sample from the community school or neighborhood? Will your recruitment goals be affected by other researchers that are recruiting the same population as your study? Also, how are you going to recruit your participants? For example, can you approach them in the clinic or hospital waiting room? Are you relying primarily on provider referrals from your enrollment? Will you be utilizing various ad placements such as social media, flyers in the community, or mail outs? When thinking about the operations, you're also going to need to spend some time thinking about the inclusion and exclusion criteria for each group of participants, as that criteria may have an impact on recruitment and enrollment and meeting your planned enrollment goals. So for example, how likely will it be to find participants who fulfill all of your criteria? Are they too narrow or broad where you're going to have difficulty enrolling participants? And how specifically will you measure each one of those criteria? So let's go through these examples. So for major depressive disorder, are you going to be relying and assessing via SCID, or are you going to rely on medical records for recent diagnosis? An IQ greater than 80, will you be able to perform an IQ test? Or are you going to be relying on using proxy measures? Which of the two is more feasible for you? And the last one is absence of neurological conditions. How and who is going to be able to evaluate this? Will it be based on parent report, or are you going to be using a medical screen by a clinician? So now I'm going to hand it over to Anna to go over the other operational components to consider when writing your grant application.
Thank you, Ashley. And as Ashley's walking you through these examples, these are just examples of different kinds of things that you can think about in terms of there are many different ways to measure these inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay, here we go. So similarly for your study procedures, we want you to be thinking about what are the different procedures for each group? So as Sabiha and Ashley mentioned, it may be that your study is delivering an intervention to participants who you're going to assess mental health status or outcomes, but you may also be including providers who you're going to train in this and who you want to provide you information and feedback about this intervention. So it may be that you have both a provider group of study participants and a patient group of study participants. So as you're thinking through all of this, you want to think about what the different procedures are for those different groups. And some of the things that we're trying to walk you through to really help you think of how to make your studies really feasible. So it's one thing to have it all written on paper. It's a very different thing to start and finish the study and actually be able to recruit everybody you wanted to and have them participate in all of the different activities in your study. So you want to be thinking about how long you're expecting people to participate. Is this a study that's longitudinal? Would they be coming back several times? To think about what types of procedures and what procedures are needed to be completed. Might those procedures lead to incidental findings, for example, which Sabiha mentioned at the beginning? And if there is a potential for incidental findings, what what is your plan to deal with those? How many procedures you're conducting? Sometimes we know that you start, with one assessment and then you want to add another one, and suddenly you have 4 hours worth of assessments. And really thinking about, do you need all of those? Would that impact people's interest and ability to complete all of these study procedures? The same thing in terms of whether the procedures are really invasive. You might want to think of, whether participants will really want to participate and what might help them find that something that's valuable. Who completes the procedures with the participant? Are those study personnel, individuals who are going to be blinded to what type of arm this participant might be in? Are they getting your active new treatment? Are they getting the control? If they are blinded, you need some sort of plan or system to break a blind if something happens. For those study staff, do they need a particular type of training? Do they need to have some specific proficiency in some health background? And if they do need a training, how often do they need to be retrained, for example, or to check in around their training? You also want to think about where the procedures are going to be performed. Are these things that you're doing questionnaires over the phone? Are you having people come to a specific location, to a site that you have for your study? And that might matter for lots of reasons. One is, if you're doing a phone assessment, is that space where the participant's going to answer the phone going to be private enough? If you're having people come to your site, is it difficult to get there? Is that going to make it so that people don't really want to participate in your study, even if it sounded really interesting? And the same if you have a longitudinal study or you have a specific time frame in which you need to see people. For example, you may be screening them and then you need them to come into their first appointment within a certain amount of time. Really thinking about what that window needs to be is very helpful, because sometimes the window becomes too narrow or isn't really realistic or feasible, and you end up with all these issues in following your protocol because the window itself was a little bit too stringent or not really realistic. So really thinking through, if people are going to have a 3-month follow-up, can they come 1 week before 3 months? Can they come 2 weeks before 3 months? What is a reasonable amount of time that fits within your study and your research, but also within the realities of, people's lives and participating in research studies? If your study has pharmacological procedures, that's also something you need to think through. For example, some studies ask individuals to discontinue medications that they're taking before they start a study. We call that a medication washout. And if that's something you're doing in your study, you really want to think about who's going to be directing that and how they're going to monitor the safety. For example, if you're taking someone off of medications, their symptoms might get worse before they're even able to start your study procedures. And how would you address those kinds of situations? And who is allowed to do that in the countries in which these are occurring? Does it have to be a physician? Do they have the appropriate licensing and training that they need to be able to do that? The same counts for, an intervention where you may be giving someone a medication and slowly increasing the dose. How are you going to do that dose increase, that titration? Who's going to direct it? And who's going to monitor to make sure that if people are having side effects or any concerns around that, those are being addressed in this study? As I mentioned, it's very important to know who can write prescriptions for study medications. And those rules may vary depending on your country, in addition to some of the rules and regulations, for example, here in the States. If the study has medication that's being prepared specifically for the study, that's being compounded for that study, you want to be really clear on where that compounding is occurring and whether that site, if it's a pharmacy, if it's a lab, has everything, is following all of the regulations in that local country, region, state in order to compound the medication. Sometimes there are very stringent rules around what's coming in, what's going out, where all these things are being tracked and how they're being tracked. So you want to make sure that you are aware of all of the rules and regulations in the place where your study is taking place, including your institution, to know that you're following what needs to occur. If your study has a medication that, for example, is only available through the study, you really want to think about what's going to happen to participants when the study ends. Are they no longer going to have access to that medication? How are you going to transition their care? Who could continue their treatment once the study ends? And similarly, you want to be thinking about whether there are stopping rules for your study. And what that means is there may be certain things that if they occur, it would signal to you that the study should stop even if you have not completed recruiting all the participants in your study. So what kind of situations might those be? As you're thinking about your study procedures, you want to, again, think about the risks that are associated with participating with the procedures for each group. So for some, the main risk may be loss of confidentiality. You're asking the provider their opinion on how this intervention went. For others, it might be something more. They might be experiencing adverse effects. They might have negative outcomes from the intervention that you're leading, and you want to think about what those risks might be. And similarly, you want to think about what procedures you can put in place to help address those risks. So if you have a lot of assessments, you might be thinking about, well, people could become distressed with certain questions. So you might have a plan for how you would address that. You might want to structure having sufficient breaks so people can take a break in between different assessments. If people are endorsing really severe clinical symptoms, you might want to have a clear plan in place for how you would refer people to get clinical care, especially if they have something like suicidal ideation, or if there are other types of situations that you're obligated to report about, for example, elder abuse or child abuse. And we know that there are different rules for all of these in different countries. So you want to be sure you're aware of what the rules are in your institution, in your state, in the country you're in terms of really being compliant with the rules and the regulations, and also, most importantly, thinking about the safety of the participants in your study. Okay, so confidentiality and quality assurance. So we talked a lot about confidentiality and really thinking about how you're going to ensure that the information you're collecting from your participants remains private. So, first you want to think about where you're collecting the information and how you're recording it. Are you recording it on paper? Are you making video recordings? Are you putting it into some sort of electronic data capture system? And how are those different forms, different systems protected? So if you're collecting paper forms in the field, how are you making sure that those paper forms are kept safe until you get yourself to your research facility, and then where they're going to be kept and how they're going to be kept so other people aren't able to access them? Are you storing them in a lockbox? Are you storing them in the trunk of your car, which could easily be broken into and you might lose the materials? The same thing for data quality. You want to be thinking about how you're going to check for errors. If you're entering data on paper first and then putting it into an electronic system, how are you making sure that transferring the data from the paper to the system doesn't include errors? And there are lots of different types of ideas to help you make sure that the data is entered correctly. So different studies have different types of data quality procedures. Some may be entering the data twice if it's going from paper into a system. Others may be having algorithms within the systems to highlight to you a value that is totally out of range. For example, my blood sugar could be 2,500. Well, that's a number that my blood sugar could never be. And so the system may have parameters where it says, oh, there might be an error here, go back and check. We also want you to think about whether these systems you have an audit trail. So, for example, a lot of people may be familiar with Excel. Excel doesn't have an audit trail, right? You can enter data into a little box, you can delete it, and the data is gone forever. And you don't have any way of knowing who entered the data, when they entered it, and if it was altered, what the changes were. Whereas there are other systems that are now being used very widely that allow you to make sure that the data is entered, that you know who entered it, when they entered it, and if there are changes, that you're able to track what the original entry was and what the changes were, and you have an understanding of why that data was changed. Who has access to your data? You want to be really sure that if you're dealing with protected health information, only the people who should be privy to that information have access to it and nobody else does. And another thing to think about is how long are you expected to store this research data? NIH has rules for retaining research data for at least 3 years from the time of your final report, but we know that some institutions have even more longer terms that they expect people to keep their data. So this is something else for you to check in with, both for your institution, for the country your study may be taking place in, or what any other kind of regulations you need to follow. For example, if your study's FDA regulated, they have other stipulations for how long you need to store your research data after your study's concluded. Regulatory considerations. And so Sabiha at the beginning talked a little bit of some of the resources. I know we've put them in the chat in terms of resources we have here in the US to help think about all of these regulatory considerations. But this is something that we know varies from country to country. And we've seen some global studies where there are several different regulatory bodies that you need to be interacting with at any given moment in time. So most places have either an institutional review board or an ethics board, something in that realm. Oftentimes we see ministries of health involved. Institutions and universities have other regulations, policies that you need to follow. And then you may have a data safety monitoring board or some other oversight body in your study. And so you want to make sure that you're tracking all of your regulatory documents so that you're always in approval of all of the different regulatory bodies, and you know when you need to submit updates in your documents. We really recommend that you keep track of the versions and the dates of your documents so that you're using the most up-to-date and approved consent form, for example, and that all of the forms that you're using are the ones you're supposed to be using in your study. And again, having a really good system to track approvals, especially if you have a lot of different regulatory bodies you're dealing with, is really important because otherwise your study may have to stop if one of your approvals lapses. And then it's really important to make sure that your study staff is really well trained, that they understand the importance of these different oversight bodies, and that they're always using the most up-to-date and approved documents in the study. And, you know, the consent form is a perfect example of that, but you may have other documents that you need to make sure you're using the most recent and approved version for. Consent and assent into studies is really, really, really important. And we think you should double check with your own institution and your ethics or institutional review board to make sure that you're aware of all of their policies in addition to the policies of the Office of Human Research Protection and the NIH. Things to think about is, you know, where you're going to be consenting participants. You know, if you're going to be consenting them in the field, you want to make sure that you have a space that's private where people have an opportunity to ask questions and to discuss things with you. You want to think about whether it's going to be in an office, over the phone, and that your regulatory body, your IRB or ethics committee, is aware of how you're actually intending to consent the participants. Is it going to be an oral consent or is it going to be a written consent? And there may be some rules around what kinds of things can be done with an oral consent versus which ones need to have a written consent. You want to think about who's qualified to consent participants and make sure that they really understand what the consent process is about, so that they're conveying all of the information to the participants so that they really are able to consent voluntarily to participate in your study. And you want to think about whether these individuals need training. There are a variety of different types of trainings to help make sure everybody understands how important consent and assent are. Some studies, we know some countries and some institutions require there to be a witness to the consent. So again, you want to be familiar with what the rules are in your institution and in your country in terms of what needs to be included in the consent form. In some studies, you need to evaluate capacity to consent. And if that's the case in your study, you want to have a plan of how you're going to do that and how you're going to document that you have done that. And similarly, as Sabiha mentioned, assent for minors might vary depending the age for when you consent versus assent might vary. And there may be rules related to specific health topics in which even if a minor can't consent to some things, there is information that you're not allowed to share with their parents or guardians. So being really familiar with what the rules are related to consent and assent and what information can and can't be shared with parents or guardians is really important for you to be clear about. We talked a little bit about reportable events, and we did have a link in there for the NIMH policy around reportable events. But again, you really want to think about what an adverse event is, what a serious adverse event is, what an unanticipated problem that potentially may pose risk to participants. All of these definitions for the US, for the Office of Human Research Protection, are posted in these links. I think it's a similar link to the one we sent earlier. And then the really important thing is you want to think about how you're going to track these things, right? Are you going to be checking in with people periodically and systematically asking them questions around adverse events or serious adverse events? How often are you going to be doing that? And what happens in between those times in which you're talking to people? Are you going to give them a phone number and say, please call me if you have some sort of problem? Or what's your process going to be able to keep track of any adverse events that occur in your study? You also want to have some thoughts about what is an expected adverse event in your study, and how you're going to determine whether that adverse event is related to your study. So for example, someone may walk into the clinic, slip on a pedal, fall, and break their leg. And that is an adverse event in your study. They were coming to your clinic to see you, but it may not be related to the intervention in your study. So you really need to be thinking about how you're going to classify all of these different adverse events and who's in charge of making those determinations. And then very importantly, you want to think about when and how and to whom you need to report those events to. So as I mentioned, the NIMH has a policy that walks you through certain types of events, like serious adverse events that are related to your study, maybe things that you need to report in a very short period of time, whereas adverse events may be something that you report periodically. And different regulatory bodies, different IRBs or ethics committees have different rules about when they expect you to submit these reports. So it's important to know what the expectations are for the different organizations that you're working with. Similarly, you want to think about what a protocol violation is or what a protocol deviation is. And some institutions and some IRBs spell this out very clearly. So you want to keep track of those as well. You want to know when are you not following your protocol and what happened. And of course, if this is something that needs a correction or needs you to address something or retrain your study team, these are important things for you to track and to make sure you're addressing appropriately. And as I've said over and over again, it's just really important to know what your institutional policies are. So if you're getting an NIH grant, NIH has expectations about how you're going to conduct your study, and that is layered onto whatever your institution's expectations are and the country in which your study may be taking place. So being sure that you know how often you need to report the different adverse events and protocol violations and to whom and within what time frame is very important. Okay, so we thought we'd do some questions again, just to wake everybody up. So here's a study operations question. So there's a psychologist who's being trained in a new behavioral therapy. Their level of proficiency of the new behavioral therapy and the acceptability of the therapy is being evaluated. The provider is also piloting the new therapy in adolescents ages 12 to 17, and the parents of the adolescents as well. The research assistant will be collecting data both from the adolescents and the parents. So who could be considered a research participant in this study? A, the adolescents, B, the parent and the adolescents, C, the parent and the adolescent and the psychologist, and D, the parent, the adolescent, the psychologist, and the research assistant. Okay, we've got some variability here. I'm seeing a few A's and some B's and C's. Here we go. The answer is the parents and the adolescents and the psychologist. And again, this is why we're covering these questions, because this comes up a lot for people. So if your intervention is not only delivering care, let's say, to this adolescent and their parent, but is also training the provider, asking the provider what they think of the training, whether it's been acceptable, then you might want to think about what kind of data you're collecting from that provider and whether they too should be considered a research participant. Okay, here's a second question. In the same study, one of the exclusion criteria for the adolescent is an IQ below 70. Which one would not typically be used to operationalize, that means to turn it into an action that you can track, this exclusion criteria? So A, to perform a full neuropsychological testing, B, to obtain previous documented testing results, C, to use school report cards or grades as a proxy, or D, having the child chew gum. Okay, this one had a little less variability in the responses. not just as a teaser, but just to think, right, there are many different ways to operationalize your different inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it's really about giving some thought of how you're going to take that criteria and turn it into a reality for your study. So having the child chew gum was the answer. Okay, here's study question 3. Which of these procedures might make it difficult to recruit and retain study participants? Obtaining a one-time cheek swab, obtaining depression ratings every 3 months for 2 years, obtaining study questionnaires during regular clinic visits, or offering transportation to and from research sites and a flexible scheduling time, which might make it difficult to recruit and retain study participants. Yeah, so mostly people are answering B. There is a little bit of variability, but this is one to think about, right? Longitudinal studies where you're asking people to stay engaged with your study and keep coming in and answering questionnaires or providing different study samples over 2 years might be something a little bit more difficult to make sure you're able to retain all of those participants. And you need to be really mindful of how you're going to try to ensure success in keeping participants enrolled in your study. Okay, here's question number 4. Which of the following is an adverse event? A participant slips and breaks his leg during a study visit. A participant has an allergic reaction to the study medication. A participant reports suicidal ideation during a study visit. Or D, all of the above. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of consensus on this one. And yes, it is all of the above. Okay, so we are wrapping up our time today for the webinar, and we're going to now start the Q&A, but we do want you to know that the slides will eventually be posted on the website. I think Leo put the link in there, and that the slides really have a lot of resources. And so we want you to have a way of seeing those resources together. They're slightly organized by topic and so that you can access them in the future as well, because we know there's a lot of information in the talk today and it's hard to keep track of everything. Leo, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Anna, Ashley, and Sabiha for this wealth of knowledge. I was taking notes myself, and there's a lot to learn. Thank you for making sure that the slides had those links. I find them very useful, not only today, but for future reference as well. All right, so we have a few written questions. Some of you have received written answers already, but I'm going to read out loud some of the, or all of the thematic or content questions. Miriam Brooks, and by the way, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your first name or last name. I promise you I'm trying to do my best. Miriam Brooks asks Sabiha the following question. Sabiha started the presentation talking about the clinical trials form, which asks for a lot of the information. She asked inclusion criteria, study population, ages, etc. Can we just say, quote, see clinical trial form, or just focus on the information that ISNT in that form when we do the human subjects attachment? Sabiha?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I think you're asking whether or not you can reference other sections of your grant application when you're filling out the protection of human subjects form or attachment that is part of this larger PHS clinical trials information form. Because the protection of human subjects attachment is peer reviewed, I would recommend that you include all relevant information. There are some points that you're required to put in there. And so I would recommend that you do include the information in that section when you were filling out the data safety monitoring plan, if it's relevant for your study or you decide to have one. I think in that section, that's where you can reference other parts of your grant application so that you're not redundant. But I think because that protection of human subjects section is closely reviewed during peer review, it's probably in your best interest to include the information there as well.
Thank you, Sabiha. We have a question for you as well, Sabiha, from Phoebe Gilbert. Phoebe asks, who and what is responsible for reviewing any submissions? What verification processes are used by these reviewers, and what documentation is being processed?
I hope I understand the question. I think this is in regard to submitting your grant application. And your grant application typically goes through a peer review process. And so there's a group of your peers who review it, and they have certain guidelines that they use to review it, and they kind of have a discussion about it during a meeting, and they come up with any concerns or questions that they have, or anything that they think you're doing really well. They comment on those, and my colleagues can add on to that if I missed anything.
Yeah, and I think, Leo, I think one of the webinars in the webinar series is about the NIMH review process. So, and I think that talk is already posted on the website. So that might be a good place to get some additional information. The NIH does have very clear steps in how they receive the applications, how they refer the applications to the different institutes once they receive them, and then the process that it goes through in terms of how the review is managed, whether it's managed by the NIH central review process or the different institutional review processes, et cetera.
Thank you, Sabiha and Anna. That is correct. Anna, on April 14th of last year, the first webinar was entitled Submission and Peer Review of NIH Grant Applications. The speaker that day was Nick Gayano, who is the branch chief for the review branch at Division of Extramural Affairs here at NIMH. He provided a comprehensive overview of how review works. Just one point to complement to Anna's and Sabiha's answer. We, of course, do have these review sections, these review panels that are external peer reviewers who do that first review. They provide a document that is called a summary statement that all applicants receive. And a subgroup of those applications that were reviewed that could be considered for funding goes to what is called a second level or second tier review that is done internally by NIMH folks, including colleagues from OCR and primarily colleagues from program at NIMH. All right, Sabiha. I promise I'll turn on to questions for Ashley and Anna very soon. Sabiha, Padma Sankaran asks, if foreign sites are involved in the multi-site study that originated in the US, what is the rule for single IRV?
Again, I think this question is asking if there is a multi-site non-exempt human subject study that has sites both in foreign countries as well as the United States. What do you do in terms of the single IRV policy? According to the policy, foreign sites participating in these NIH-funded multi-site studies do not need to, they're not expected to follow this policy. So the foreign site is not expected to. But for instance, if you have multiple US sites in the same grant, those multiple US sites are required to follow the single IRB policy.
Thank you, Sabiha, and thank you, Padma, for asking that question. Padma also asked a question now for Ashley, I believe. In case of providers doing pre and post knowledge assessment after completing a training developed as part of research, are they considered participants?
Yeah, if you're collecting data on the providers for the pre and post, they would be considered participants.
And so one thing to think about, Padma, is those participants have, would have a consent that's addressing their risks of participation in the study. So it might not look like the consent form for the participants who got the intervention itself, right? But this is a group of research participants, and you need to think about how you're going to consent them into the study, what information you're going to be collecting from them, what kind of risks there are for those participants, for those providers, what risks exist in providing that information to you, and how you're going to address those risks.
This reminds me of a conversation that we had recently with some applicants. And Ashley, Anna, and Sabiha, please correct the following statement if need be. We were discussing that clinical trials, subjects for clinical trials are not only patients or community members themselves. They can also be health system participants, either providers at different levels. And they can be a subject of research, but also subject of intervention. And I think you also alluded to that in a few of your slides.
Yeah, that's totally true. And for example, we see a lot of implementation studies where you may be conducting focus groups, where you may be collecting these types of assessments from a variety of different individuals. And again, if you're collecting data, research data that you're going to be using to answer research questions, those individuals are participants in your research study, even if they're not the patient or the target population for your intervention.
So we are interested in improving mental health outcomes at the individual and community level, and that entails doing research not only at that level, but also upstream in the health system and maybe sometimes outside of the health system as well. All right.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Leo, that it's not always so straightforward. So that's why we're encouraging you to think about what information you're collecting from whom. And that might help you think about, is there a chance that this person would be considered a research participant? And if you're not sure, your institutional review board or your institution's human research protection program probably has resources and individuals that can help you think about, would this person be considered a participant? And do I need to prepare a specific consent form for them?
This question came, Anna, while you were presenting. It's from Ashanif Tadele. The question is, depending on the type of clinical study, the investigators ask the IRB to waive the study to conduct in the minors or vulnerable groups. Do you have such kind of experience at NIH?
Yeah, so there is, I mean, Sabiha is probably even more of an expert in this than I am, but, in the US, the Office of Human Research Protections is our regulatory body that regulates the IRBs, and they define a lot of these regulations around how you consent, when you can waive consent. And there might be instances where IRBs even consult with them to see if that's an instance in which consent can be waived. So certainly, I think the NIH has experience with that. And we also know that rules and regulations around this can vary in different countries. And so we've provided links and resources to things we have here in the States, but there may be specific rules and regulations around when consent can be waived in the country that you're conducting your study in. And if that's really different than what the rules and regulations are here, you might be prepared to answer additional questions of how that will work, because people just want to make sure that you're only enrolling participants in your study who are appropriately consented. So it is a very important topic to all of us. Sabiha, I don't know if you had anything else to add to that.
No, I totally agree. I was going to say that here in the US, we do have federal regulations that allow IRBs to waive informed consent, but there are very specific criteria that the IRB uses to determine whether or not that's appropriate for the study or for the population. So to answer the question, yes, we do have that here in the United States. But as Anna said, it's important to note what's being done in country as well if you're doing a study that is at a foreign site.
I see. Marian Brooks asks another question. Thank you, Marian, for these questions. Is the protection of human subjects form supposed to be identical to an IRB protocol?
No, it's not. So it will include a lot of the same information. It's not meant to be identical. And also IRB applications differ between IRBs, but NIH has very specific guidelines for how your protection of human subjects attachment what it should include. And then I will actually put a link in the chat that links to that document that I was talking about early on that outlines every section of the grant and the corresponding guidelines for what you should include. So to answer your question, no, it's not identical. It may have the same information.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent question. It helps us understand that sometimes we use the same information in different ways in different parts of this project, but that the way we present it, and maybe sometimes even the content of it may not be the same. I think it was a terrific question. Thank you, Marion. Hilda Mendoza asks the following question. Can you expand a little on participants' monetary compensation guidance during enrollment?
So the only thing that I can speak to in terms of monetary compensation is that you need to make sure, one, that the amount isn't coercive within the population that will be involved in the study, and also that it is allowable. And the reason that I brought it up in our presentation was that oftentimes we see it as listed as a potential benefit of the study, and that's not how it should be presented. It should not be presented as a benefit, because then it does become potentially give the appearance of being coercive.
And just to add into that, I mean, I think, with all of these ethics questions, there's a lot of gray sometimes, and there are very specific study populations in which there's debate about, what's an appropriate compensation. And I can think of examples of a conference a few years ago where there was a lot of conversation around monetary compensation in a population that is addressing substance use, and how that might be a good thing and how it might be a bad thing. What are the risks? Would it contribute to more substance use? So I think this is a topic that's not, there's not a clear guide, line that you must always do it this way or you can't do it that way. It's really that you want to be very thoughtful about how that compensation is being, decided, what is appropriate. We know that different institutions and different IRBs have guidelines and have very strict rules. And we really want to make sure that it's what you're doing is compensating for people's time, for transportation, for things that are appropriate, and not leading to something that might be considered concerning from an ethical perspective. So I think that it's just something to give a lot of consideration. And also, like we said before, oftentimes institutional review boards or human research protection programs have people who can help guide you in terms of how to think about this and what is considered appropriate and not coercive.
Anna, is it fair to say that for these topics that are gray in nature, they don't have a distinct binary answer, potential applicants can come to the program and ask those questions, and we can also get some preliminary feedback from OCR before the application is submitted? Is that something that is available?
I mean, OCR is available to consult for some of these more difficult questions. I would say that my first recommendation would be that if you have questions about ethical issues, that you start with your ethics review body at your institution, because they will be the most knowledgeable around, the rules and regulations in the country where you're conducting the study and in the populations that you may be working with. We're certainly, available to provide additional consultation to that, but that would be the place where I would start, because it's really going to give you a lot, many of these ethics rules. For many of them, context really matters in terms of understanding what you're proposing and what might be, different factors to consider.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. Olajukome Ojelegi asks, how do you handle confidentiality issues with pregnant adolescents / adolescent mothers as study participants? Should their parents be invited for focus group discussions or interviews?
I think that's a great question. And it's another one where, the locality matters, right? There are different rules in the US. There are, state-based rules in addition to federal regulations in terms of how this gets managed. And I'm sure in different countries of the world, there are different rules as well. So depending on where your study is taking place, you have to be very thoughtful about what are the rules and regulations, and what do you feel how are you going to inform those adolescents about how you would manage certain types of information? You want to be very clear up front. If there's information that you can't keep private from a teen, you want to be very upfront with them. Like, this is the type of information that I would have to talk to, and whoever you need to talk to about. So instances where you have to break confidentiality. I think there, here in the US and in many states, there are very clear rules around how you manage information related to pregnancy specifically. There are also rules around mental health and a number of other health topics. So it can be very health topic specific. And you really need to be familiar with what those rules are and have a plan in place to provide the information upfront and then address it if an issue comes up. I don't know if Sabiha, Ashley, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think you covered it.
I do think it's an excellent question. It's the kinds of things you want to be thinking about for your study, way ahead of time as you're putting together how you're going to conduct it.
Great. We've addressed all the written questions that we have received. Ashley, Sabiha, Anna, is there anything else you want to share? Any additional point that you think the audience should have in mind, or I should have in mind as I learn from if everyone wants to?
I just wanted to note, I put some of the links in the chat box. Those are very helpful links when you're filling out your grant application. I highly recommend that you take a look at them. The first one is the general instructions for the entire grant application. And the second link I provided is for the Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form. And they have a lot of detail in there. And there are some additional resources embedded into that. I also recommend you visit the NIMH OCR website, the Office of Clinical Research website, as well as NIH's Human Research Protection website. And I can try to include those very quickly in there as well.
I think we added them at the beginning, Sabiha, including the OCR website. And
okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Well, once again, thank you everyone for attending this webinar wherever you are, whether it's morning time, lunch, noon time, or evening time. Maybe it's past midnight in some places where you are. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Special thanks to the three of you, Sabiha, Anna, and Ashley, for sharing all this knowledge, for educating us, and for answering these questions. And also thank you for all the staff that has been working backstage in ensuring that this webinar is possible. Again, our next webinar is on September 20th. We will be discussing RDoC in global mental health. If you do not know what RDoC is, or you're not entirely familiar with those concepts, that will be a great opportunity to further our knowledge on those domains as well. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.